Of UCLA Center for Jewish Studies. It's a delight to see so many here on this very summer afternoon here at UCLA, and to welcome our speaker, who many of you know, and in some ways needs no introduction because he's coming back to UCLA after a bit of a time away to pursue many research interests, Fabrizio Lelli. Many of you may remember that he was our first Viterbi visiting professor of Mediterranean Jewish Studies, and we were fortunate enough to be able to bring him back to UCLA for a sequence of lectures on some of his recent work as part of our Viterbi program in Mediterranean Jewish Studies. The lecture today is part of a series, so there's 3 lectures that are interconnected, and we hope to see some continuity. I think you'll find that they'll build on each other, and we hope to see you at the other 2, which will be next week. A little bit about the lecture series today. I mentioned it's part of our ongoing program in Mediterranean Jewish Studies, but it's really a collaboration with a number of institutes and departments at UCLA that have made this possible. First and foremost, the Center for Jewish Studies, the Department of History, the Department of Italian, and the Center for Mediterranean and Renaissance Studies, as well as our Institute for Italian Culture, I should say, the one in Westwood. It's not associated with UCLA. But it shows a broad interest in this program, and particularly in the work of Fabrizio. Fabrizio, as I mentioned, was our first Viterbi visiting professor of Mediterranean Jewish Studies. He's currently associate professor of Hebrew language and literature at the University of Salento. And his research ranges extraordinarily wide, from philosophical and mystical literature of late medieval and early modern Italian Jewish authors, the intellectual relations between Jewish and Christian scholars in the Italian Renaissance. He's published extensively on cultural relations between southern Italian Jewish communities in the Balkans, and most recently he's working on oral and written testimonies of Jewish refugees in DP camps operated by the United Nations in post-World War II southern Italy. The talk today, though, will take us far from that, at least temporally. And I should mention the workshop today is the introduction to the sequence of workshops. Today's talk is on the influence of humanist culture in Sephardi Scholars Active in medieval Italy. It'll lay the framework for understanding a number of generations of scholarly communities in the late 14th and 15th century, particularly Sephardic families moving from Sicily to other regions, Calabria in particular, focusing on their social and intellectual environment, their written production, and the legacy in southern Italian Judaism. So we're in for quite a wonderfully exciting and refreshing series of lectures. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Fabrizio, and we'll get us started. So thank you for coming.
So thank you. So it's me to thank you for inviting me, for giving me the pleasure to be back to Los Angeles, to UCLA. I'm very honored. I feel very honored to be here. And I'm also honored because I'd like to say that the beginning of this research project, the beginning of this research activity took place exactly during the period I was researching here at UCLA in 2007. And from that time on, I kept trying researching the history of Sephardi families working in Renaissance Italy, particularly southern Italy. The reason why I'm interested in southern Italy is that I teach there, and you will see in a couple of minutes where exactly, in the heel of the boot, of the Italian boot. And this is the reason why many of the names which will be mentioned during my talk are related to the area where I teach, because I'm trying to find out, as far as possible, memories, evidence of the legacy of this Sephardic culture, which was so thriving in the 14th, 15th century. Before starting, I might remind you, if you allow me so, that the reason why I hold it such an important thing to research deeply in this field is that from the beginning of the 16th century on, almost all traces of Jewish presence disappeared from southern Italy because, as you may know, Jews were forbidden to live in the Kingdom of Naples when the Kingdom of Naples was absorbed by the Kingdom of Spain. So the same expulsion that had taken place in 1492 from the Iberian Peninsula was extended, the same decree of expulsion was extended to southern Italy. And between 1510 and 1541, all Jewish families, all Jews living in southern Italy were obliged either to convert to Christianity or to leave. And this is the reason why I thought it important while being in southern Italy for my teaching activities to try to focus a little bit more on the very scant evidence of this Jewish presence, which still is there, and on the evidence which may be found out all over the whole world in manuscripts, in other materials that were produced in southern Italy, but that, as we will see in my lecture, in my paper, but that were scattered around the world due to many events that took place from the 16th century on. So, as Todd, whom I really thank, correctly said, this will be the first three lectures, and this will allow me, hopefully so, to introduce a little bit the field and the context. We'll be speaking about individuals. We will see that those individuals or families, and we will see what I mean by individuals and families. We will see that those individuals were not natives of Italy, they were not originally born in Italy. Some of them came from Spain, from Catalonia, from Provence, and we will see why they happened to go to Italy. And we will see what happened with them after they left southern Italy and were obliged to move northward, especially to Venice. So in this first lecture, we will be dealing with this first step, this first stage of the story. I mean, these first generations of scholars who lived in southern Italy and were coming from other countries, Mediterranean countries mostly. And in the second and third lectures, we will see what happened with their descendants when they were obliged to move from southern Italy north, and what happened with their legacy. My goal, my aim is that of showing, possibly, whether there was a continuity from their original Iberian backgrounds through their Italian stay, the period they stayed in Italy, they resided in southern Italy, and what happened with this legacy once they left southern Italy, and how that legacy merged into other trends of thought which were popular in northern Italy in particular. So, let's start. So, what I'm going to deal with today is the extent to which Jewish communities in southern Italy, and especially in the Adriatic region called Apulia, which is the present-day region that you see in orange color there. You see, this is a very long stripe of land extending along the Adriatic Sea. the heel of the boot, as I was mentioning before, is the area of Lecce. And Lecce is exactly the name of the city where I teach, of my university. And the area of Lecce was called and is still called Salento. So what we will discuss today will be mostly related to Jewish communities and mostly Jewish individuals, Jewish scholars, who happen to be working in the Salento region between the end of the 14th and the 15th century. We will see that most of these individuals share a common phenomenon, they have something in common. They all were physicians, they all were medical doctors, which was one of the most common professions, as you may know, among Italian Jews, but I'd like to add among Mediterranean Jews, our Jews especially of Spanish origin, throughout the whole Middle Ages. The reason why there were so many Jewish physicians was that the career of medical doctor was one of the very few careers which was open to Jews in a non-Jewish environment, especially in the Middle Ages. You have to figure out that we are talking about a period when most of the cultural institutions were run by religious authorities, and we are talking especially about a Christian environment, so most of the cultural institutions were run by Christian authorities, and for that reason, people who didn't belong to the Christian faith were excluded by those institutions. There was a possibility, though, for Jews who wanted to become physicians. They were not allowed generally, I'm talking in general terms, they were not allowed to attend classes in those institutions, but they were allowed to take exams, which seems strange, but it's important. So what happened, when we are talking about physicians particularly, Jews could get prepared at home, let's say so, and that's what they did. And how could they? There was a long-lasting tradition of medical knowledge which was handed down from generation to generation, and so they generally belonged to families where fathers were teaching sons to become physicians. And that was the only way for them to take exams, because they could study with their own fathers or uncles or whoever already got a physician's license and practiced the physician's art, the medical art. And once they were ready, they submitted their CV to the Christian universities, institutions, and they were allowed to take exams. And if they passed successfully these exams, they could get a certificate, a license. And here, this is the reason why I'm showing you the slide, because this is one of the very few cases where we have a medical license still extant today. It is written in Latin. I'm sorry, the quality of the image is not that good, but this is what I could find on the internet, because this medical certificate was sold at an auction recently, and it now belongs to a private collection. Unfortunately, I'm saying outside of Italy, because they were trying hard in Naples to buy this license for it to stay in Naples, where it was issued originally on July 5th, 1492. What a year! Yeah. You see, it was in 1492, just a month earlier. Yeah, a month earlier than the expulsion of the Jews from the Iberian Peninsula. And the guy who received this certificate was a very well-known person, a very well-known philosopher and medical doctor, whose name was Abraham the Balmes. As you may see by his name, his family was originally a Catalan family. They were from Catalonia, and we can trace back their settling in southern Italy to the end of the 14th century. We will see later on during my talk that most of the families, of the Jewish families that went to southern Italy from Catalonia, happened to arrive in Italy between the end of the 14th and the beginning of the 15th century, because that was the most critical period of anti-Jewish decrees in Catalonia. Okay? Catalonia has been a favorable place, a very tolerant place for Jews during the 14th century, but at the end of the 14th century, as we will see later on, most of them, again, were obliged either to convert or to leave, and most of them decided to leave either for southern France, because they were speaking Catalan, and in southern France they were speaking a Provençal variety of French, which was very similar to Catalan. And as you may know, Catalan and Provençal are very similar to medieval Italian. And so the other place where these people could go, could end up to be, was Italy, because in Italy they could express very freely. I mean, they didn't have problems to learn the local language, and particularly in southern Italy, they could live in a very tolerant situation, because especially from the beginning of the 15th century on, the local political authorities were heavily influenced by Catalan kingdom, and around the mid of the 15th century, southern Italy was conquered by a branch of the kings of Aragon, of the Catalan kings of Aragon, and so there was a continuity in politics. The only difference was that in southern Italy, those kings, that branch of the Catalan family allowed Jews to settle in Italy, especially when they were physicians, because they were in need of cultured Jewish physicians to establish a new schools of medicine. But in spite of that, Christian authorities didn't let them go to the university. So this is very interesting, because we have a few cases of people whom we know were not attending universities, as I was telling you before, but they received certificates, medical licenses, and this was the case of Abraham de Balmes. And the reason why I'm particularly interested in Abraham de Balmes is that after receiving this certificate and after working a lot as a medical doctor in southern Italy, particularly in Naples and in the Adriatic region that I mentioned before, Apulia, at the beginning of the 16th century, we know that he was among those who were obliged to leave, and he decided to move north to Venice, where he became the personal physician of a very important cardinal, who involved him in a major project consisting in translating Aristotelian works from Hebrew into Latin. And Abraham de Balmes then became one of the most important translators, that is to say, one of the most important cultural mediators between Arabic and Hebrew culture into Latin. His works were mostly published in Venice throughout the 16th century. I'm telling you all this because I want to stress that most of the Sephardic scholars were deeply involved in activities consisting of mediating from different cultures into the local cultures, meaning that this is very important, and this is what we will try to see later on. most of these families, most of these people, most of these medical doctors were at the same time involved in medical practice, meaning that they were doctors themselves, they were practicing medicine, but at the same time they were very powerful intellectual figures, and they had the very important task to introduce their Christian partners, their Christian audiences, to works that had been lost in the West. And they could do so because coming from Spain or from southern France, they still had many works available in Hebrew that were translations from Arabic, that belied Arabic texts that had been lost in the West. So this is very important because at the same time you have to think of those people as performing medical duties, being actual physicians, but at the same time living in very thriving intellectual centers where they could make all this legacy available to non-Jews, both to Jews and non-Jews. This is very important. And this is the way those Sephardic scholars living in Italy, working in Italy, became such an active mediating link between cultures. Okay? Had it been for those Sephardic scholars, many works would have been totally lost. Okay? And this is a part of the Renaissance environment which needs to be stressed, because when we think of the humanist environment, we generally think of people who were translating from Greek into Latin and who were working to make Greek texts available in Latin, but we almost never remember that those people were also interested in other languages, especially Oriental languages, and they were paying fortunes to hire professional translators that help them translate from Arabic into Latin, from Hebrew into Latin, from Armenian into Latin, from any other Oriental language into Latin. It was not only from Greek into Latin, it was a major process of translations that took place in Italy. So you have to imagine, to figure out how those Jews coming from Spain, being so deeply influenced by their Sephardic culture, could be helpful for the humanist environment. And they provided so many translations, and they were so helpful to endow Renaissance Italy with translations from other languages, particularly from Oriental languages. Okay? This is very important. So this is the reason why I want to open my lecture, my paper, showing you this, because this is a Latin document which gives you an idea, a vague idea of the complicated situation of these Jewish physicians working in Italy, not only as medical doctors, but also as mediators, cultural mediators. Another one, living in the same generation, another important figure whom you might know, of course, is Leone Ebreo. The original name was Yehuda Abravanel, or Abarbanel. He was also the scion of one of the most important families, originally from Spain, then they went to Portugal, then back to Spain, and then they were obliged to leave, and then they ended up in the Kingdom of Naples. And Leone Ebreo was probably one of the most important authorities in non-Jewish environments, in Christian environments throughout the 16th century, because he wrote his dialogues of love. Actually, this is the recent edition, the recent translation, English translation, which was published by the University of Toronto Press, but was made possible through a joint program of Rossella Pescatori, whom you might know from here, from Los Angeles. She's in Italian, working in Los Angeles. And this Dialogues of Love is probably one of the most important works written in Italian by a Jewish scholar of Sephardic origin who made available to his environment, both Jewish and non-Jewish, so many traditional philosophical laws, starting from the Arabic and the Hebrew texts from the Middle Ages throughout the Neoplatonic traditions of the Italian Renaissance. But the most important thing is that instead of using Hebrew or Ladino or Spanish or any other of these spoken languages, he decided to use Italian, literary Italian, because he thought it more interesting to use the lingua franca, the common language of the intellectuals of the Renaissance period. And this is the reason why, once it was published in 1535, this work became one of his most popular works about the nature of love in 16th century Renaissance philosophy. So again, who was Judah Bravanel? We don't know much about his biography. We have very scant biographic data on him. We only know that he was the son of this major figure, this major intellectual coming from Spain, Isaac Bravanel, who was a very important exegete, a very important biblical scholar, philosopher himself, and so on and so forth. But first and foremost, Judah Bravanel, while in Italy, was a medical doctor. So his first activity consisted of being a physician to cardinals, to kings, to princes, to very important people. And this is how he was involved in these major, thriving intellectual circles that made it possible for him to become an important person, knowledgeable in the most common trends in philosophical ideas that were common in Renaissance Italy. And I'm quoting the most important people who were there. Why then I'm always referring to physicians, I told you, because they were in such a position that they could mediate, being physicians, being hired by these very important persons all through the medieval Europe and Renaissance Europe. They could find very easily books, texts available in their clients' libraries. I'm telling you this again because you have to understand that it was not an easy thing to have books available in that period, because we are talking about a period which preceded, and we are talking about a period when they had recently invented the print. They had recently, the printing industry was in its first steps, in its first stages, and books were still very expensive. Printed books were still very expensive, so only very wealthy people could buy books, and you can imagine how expensive manuscripts were. So for most of these people, it was very difficult to find material on which to ground their research. The only way was to try to find their material at their clients' homes. And this is what they did. So they were visiting their sponsors, let's say so, and they were checking their libraries, they were trying to figure out what they had, and once they found what they were interested in, they were copying those texts. And they were making either real copies or translations for themselves. And when they were visiting their libraries, they were trying to find not only texts related to medicine, as you may expect, but they were trying to find all sorts of texts, ranging from astronomy and astrology. As you might expect, astronomy and astrology was a discipline which was more or less the same. Astronomy and astrology were considered to be more or less the same thing in the Middle Ages and later on as well. And of course, astronomy and astrology were deeply related to medicine, because a physician had to be knowledgeable in astronomy to figure out when to start a therapy, when to give a medicament, when to create something, and so on and so forth. So this was very important. Then, something else, they had to know about philosophy, and particularly philosophy related to natural sciences. Then they had to know about other sciences, which is what we know pseudo-sciences, like alchemy, geomancy, many other disciplines. But then they had to be familiar with music, with mathematics, and of course with literary texts. Most of them were familiar with rhetoric, which was one of the foundations of the study programs of all institutions, both in the Jewish and non-Jewish environment. And most of these people were very good poets as well. And so they were writing poems. And they could write poems in whatever language they knew. So they could write poems in both Hebrew, Latin sometimes, Italian, dependent on where they were living. And this is also very important because the trends in their poetic production depended mostly on the influence of the contemporary society. And this is very important because when you want to reconstruct their intellectual activity, you have to be familiar with all these fields, okay? Not just with medical texts, but with all these fields. Now let's come to our family. We are going to deal with a very important, from my point of view, of course, family of medical doctors. Their name was, this is what they call themselves in manuscripts, because contemporary documents give them different names according to where they lived, as usual. You may remember that family names were not popular, were not common in that period. Only very important families had a family name, but most people didn't have a family name, and so they were just called according to their first name and their father's name. Sometimes they were just adding a nickname, which in the future period, in the following periods, would become the family name. So, the reason why I'm interested in this family, and for the time being, the only thing we know are referred to these three people here. There is a grandfather whose name was Elijah, then David Ibn Shoham, who lived in southern Italy and on the Albanian, let's say so, shore of the Adriatic, just across the sea from Apulia. And he lived between the 14th and the 15th century. And then we know about his son, David, who lived slightly afterwards into the 15th century, mostly in the heel of the Italian route, in the area of Lecce. And then we know about this latter son, Samuel ben David, who lived in the 15th century between southern Apulia, again, the island of Corfu, and Calabria. So again, we witness here the destiny, let's say so, of a family of physicians who moved into different locations according to the needs, according to people who were hiring them. And we don't know enough about that, But the only thing we can know, we can figure out, is that they were hired by very wealthy people, especially the aristocrats, who knew about the skills of Jewish doctors, and generally hired Jewish doctors to become their private physicians. Okay? So, this is very interesting because we will see something that will continue in the following century. We will see this movement of Jewish physicians and intellectuals between the heel of the Italian route and the Albanian coast of the Balkans. Okay? You understand why? Because this is the narrowest strait of Otranto, the narrowest part of the Adriatic Sea, which is very easily reachable on both sides. And this is the reason why people living in Lecce and on the coast of the Apulian region were generally leaving for Valona, the Albanian side of the Adriatic Sea, where there was a very important community of Sephardic origin, of people coming from southern Italy. Okay? And this was very interesting because Sephardi Jews living, this is very important, Sephardic Jews living in Valona between the 14th and the 15th century were distinguished from, the ones who came from southern Italy were distinguished and separated from those who came from Spain. So they have different synagogues, they have different communities. Okay? So there was a Sephardi community of people coming from the Iberian Peninsula, and there was a Sephardi community of people coming from southern Italy. Okay? So the rite was different, the minhag was different, and the traditions were different, and probably the languages were different, because these people coming from southern Italy were fluent in Italian, they could speak Italian fairly well, besides all the other languages they were familiar with. And then, at a certain moment, more or less at the same time, those same people were heading for Corfu, the island of Corfu. Why? Because Corfu, from the end of the 14th century, became part of the Venetian Empire, of the Venetian state, Venetian Republic, and Jews were tolerated by the Venetian Republic if they were not living in Venice. This is, again, a very strange thing. When they were living in the capital city, they were forbidden to live there. I mean, they could go there, they could live there for 3 days, for 4 days, they could trade in the city of Venice, but after that time, they were obliged to leave. But if they were living in the sea colonies of Venice, they were invited. They were invited to settle, and they were paid to be there. And they were receiving support from the government, and they were living in very favorable conditions, tolerance, particularly in Corfu. So, as you may understand, since Corfu, being Corfu so close to Apulia, every time there was an upheaval, an anti-Jewish upheaval, or there was something that prevented Jews from staying in southern Italy, they were fleeing to Corfu. Jews were fleeing to Corfu, hoping that sooner or later they could go back to southern Italy, because it was so close, and it was very easy to go back. And they went back and forth for centuries, until the final expulsion decree in 1541, when no Jew was allowed to stay in southern Italy any longer. And so, at that time, the Corfioti Jews were obliged to stay in Corfu or to go to Venice, because, again, Corfu was a part of the Venetian state. So those people belonging to the Iberian Shoham family were moving all the time between Lecce, Corfu, and Valona. And we find traces, we find evidence of their presence all over these places. So what were they doing? I'm skipping to the other things I wanted to tell you, because I think we have not much time left, I'm sorry. But I hope there will be questions, and we may use the time for Q&A for further information. So, what were they doing, the members of these families? Again, they were primarily physicians. So they were hired by different communities and different princes, aristocrats, to be in certain cities in southern Italy for being there. But at the same time, they were cultural mediators. Most of them were teachers. And actually, the first name we find connected to this family is an Arabic name. It's the name Mu'allim. Mu'allim in Arabic meaning teacher. This was a very common name both in the Sephardic world and in the Byzantine world. And since from a certain time on we find another name, probably an originally nickname, related to this family, the name in Hebrew is Nezer Azahav, which means in Hebrew, this is from the Bible, it's a phrase meaning golden crown. But it's an epithet which was generally associated to very clever scholars. So a person who was very smart, particularly in the Greek word, was called in Greek, was called golden crown, meaning that he was downing like a golden crown because of his knowledge, okay? So this makes us feel that probably at a certain time these people were somewhere in the Byzantine Empire, they got this nickname, and then they went back to the coast and then to Apulia and so on and so forth. So this is very interesting because the father, the grandfather of the family, Elijah ben David, whom we first find him in Bologna and then in Lecce and so on and so forth, produced several manuscripts dealing with many aspects of contemporary science. So he was copying works related to biblical scholarship, which of course was very popular in the Middle Ages, and medicine, because he himself was a medical doctor, but also about philosophy, about moral ethics, about Kabbalah. And we may figure out that he was himself a physician who was copying those manuscripts to use them in his school activities. Probably he was himself a teacher who was having students in sort of yeshivot, school teaching system. And as you may know, those yeshivot were moving from place to place according to the moves of the teachers. So when the teacher moved from a city to another place, he was moving the yeshiva, he was moving the school with him. And so this is probably what this Elijah was doing. And this is very interesting in my opinion because at the same time, while copying manuscripts, he was decorating them. And so we know this is a very unique case of a Jewish scribe, a Jewish sofer, who was decorating his own manuscripts. Sometimes they were decorating manuscripts, but in order to have them decorated, they were giving them to non-Jewish artists, who were decorating them for Jewish communities. But in this case, we know that he himself was decorating his own manuscripts, and this is very interesting because in this case, we know that the guy portrayed here was a sofer, a scribe, because it says there, sofer. And this is very interesting because here we have the outfit, the attire of a late 14th century Jewish scribe working between southern Italy and the Byzantine Empire. This is very interesting. Look at the attire. He has these very long shoes, and this very interesting coat and the beard. He has a very long beard, which are all very typical, very common traits of the fashion, the fashion which was popular in southern Italy at the same time. So it's very interesting. It's very, very interesting. It's one of the few cases where we have a portrait of a Sephardi Jew living in southern Italy in this period. Then his son, David, who was a very important physician, he produced two manuscripts that we know of. Both of them are presently kept in Vienna. And this manuscript was written in a very, very small city in southern Italy. I thought I have it. Well, I will show you where it is. It's in the real tip of the boot. Okay? It's a very small place called Specchia. When the scholars in the 19th century started working on this manuscript, they thought that this place had to be read Skopje in Macedonia. But of course, there was this epithet, della Mandolera, which people understood as a misunderstanding, as misspelling for Macedonia, but it doesn't make sense, of course. Whereas it's very clear when you know that there is a place in southern Italy called Specchia della Mandolera, it's very clear that this manuscript was produced there. Why? We don't know why, but possibly because this guy was working as a doctor there for a certain period. And actually we know that he was working in Lecce, which is very close to Specchia, in the same period. And in Lecce he's remembered as the head of the Jewish community, of the Sephardi community of the city, which is a very important information because we have very scant information about the Jewish community in Lecce in that period because we have lost all other information. So this is very interesting too because we see that the profession of physician was handed down from father to son, but not only the profession of physician, but also the profession of scribe and the profession of decorator. Because again, in this case, he himself copied the manuscript, and if you were familiar with the Hebrew writing, the medieval Hebrew writing, systems of writing, you would immediately recognize this writing as a mixture of Byzantine and Sephardic Hebrew writing, which is very interesting because probably the Sephardic writing was something that they had received as a legacy from their origin, their background, their Sephardic background, and the Byzantine traits were more common in the Balkan area, so probably they had learned how to write in this way while in Byzantium. So, but besides, he learned from his father to decorate manuscripts. And so we find here all sorts of drawings, very naive ones, representing diseases and how to treat diseases and what are the parts of the body that should be taken into account when you treat a disease. It's very important because it's a medical handbook. And this is also important, the choice of these handbooks is important because this text, as you can see, was originally written in Arabic in Andalusia in the 11th century and became the bestseller for medieval medicine, even much more circulated than Avicenna. Avicenna became more important with his canon of medicine later on. Jews kept being faithful to this text, which was a sort of encyclopedia of practical medicine, and which was circulated all over the Mediterranean places. Wherever there was a Jewish community, wherever there were Jewish physicians, one of the first books those Jewish physicians had to know was Al-Bulkasis, which was very well known also in the Latin environment. And there was a translation from Hebrew into Latin of this book. And we will see later on that this book was so important, so popular among Jews, that some other Jews working in southern Italy decided to translate this book again from Latin into Hebrew. Very strange again, because they already had a Hebrew translation, this one. But probably, since they couldn't have it at their disposal, they found the Latin version and they decided to translate it back to Hebrew. Very strange, but these were very common things that happened throughout the whole Middle Ages. And the very interesting thing is that all these translations were carried out in the same area, the area of Lecce, in the same period. Probably because it was a very important center for medical practice, and it was possible to have this material available along with other material. As you may see, we have here other decorations. They're very nice decorations. Here there is the colophon, where it appears the name. This is the where they went again. And now, again, we go back to the origins, because, as I was telling you before, most of these families who were active in southern Apulia came from Catalonia between the 14th and the 15th century. And they went first to Provence, sometimes they went back to Catalonia, sometimes they moved on to southern Italy. For the reason I've told you, mostly because the language they spoke was very similar to the language spoken in southern Italy. So those scholars mostly went to Naples, where they were hired as translators, and they became very important for translating philosophical works. Or they head to Apulia, where they became very popular as well as physicians. And for instance, I'm skipping these things. This is another part of my research, which I'd like to go into detail about it, because it's a very interesting part of my research project. I'm focusing on manuscripts, again, which were produced in southern Italy and who are now scattered all over the world. Most of these manuscripts are now kept in libraries in Eastern Europe for many reasons. If you want, I can tell you why later on. And some of those manuscripts are nowadays kept both in St. Petersburg and in Moscow. And for instance, this manuscript, which has not been studied so far, is a very interesting example of this production of medical treatises which were produced in southern Italy and which were related to this thriving phenomenon of cultural mediations made possible by Jews there, because here you find several medical treatises turned into Hebrew. Most of them were practical handbooks, and this means that they were assembled, this manuscript was assembled upon request of a medical doctor which needed those texts for his profession. Okay? So he didn't need to have very beautiful texts, he just needed something available at hand for his daily profession. So for instance, you find the first treatise, which is a translation of a gynecological treatise of medicine, and then you find a very famous, very well circulated text on the nature of wine and how wine can affect disease or can help heal a certain disease, written by one of the most important medical doctors of European Middle Ages, who was not Jewish, but has been translated into Hebrew. And then we find another work, which was one of the most important handbooks on spices and how spices can be used in medicine. And this became one of the bestsellers of Renaissance university study programs. And this book was written by this Saladino d'Ascoli, who was the physician of an aristocrat in Apulia, and probably Saladino Vascoli was himself a Jew who had converted. And this is the reason why he probably Saladino produced a translation from Latin into Hebrew of his own work for this Yaakov Belinfante, who was a Sephardi physician working in Apulia for an aristocrat. And this is also a very interesting side of the story. I'm not going to deal with that because it's very interesting. And then you see this is the same work we have mentioned before, this Abulcasis, but this time this work was translated from Latin into Hebrew. It was not the original Arabic into Hebrew translation, this was the Latin into Hebrew translation by this guy, who is a very well-known figure of Sephardic scholar who came originally from Catalonia. He moved to Perpignan, and you know that Perpignan was on the border between France, let's say so, and Catalonia. And for a certain period, Jews were allowed to stay in Perpignan, but at a certain moment they were obliged to convert. And so we have lots of documents kept in the local archives specifying that among the Jews who converted, we have this Azariah ben Joseph, Azariah ben Yosef Bonfil. And his family, of course, converted with him, but we don't know how. At a certain moment, he disappears from the local archives, and we find him in Italy. Where, in northern Italy first, in this very small place, Macerata, where, what does he do? He translates Boëtius' De Consolatione Philosophiae, Consolation of Philosophy, from Latin into Hebrew. And this is very interesting, because he uses Boëtius to demonstrate that philosophy can be used as a consolation for his own problems. And what were his problems? That in the meantime, he had gone back to Judaism. And he had to hide, because he was, in a way, he was wanted by inquisitorial authorities, because they were looking after people, they were, trying to send people to jail, whenever they found them. Because, of course, they didn't want people to go back to their original religion. And so he had to hide. And how could he hide? He was seeking for protection, for shelter at the most important courts of humanist Italy. And that's where he produced this translation from Latin into Hebrew. But this is very interesting because in the introduction to his translation, he uses Boëtius' autobiographical hints in the De Consolatione Philosophiae. You may remember that he wrote De Consolatione Philosophiae while in prison, and before he was beheaded, and before he died. And so he was saying that through philosophy he could receive consolation, and so on and so forth. So he's saying the same. I need consolation from philosophy, and so on and so forth, which is very humanist style. And then he moved again to southern Italy. And there, he became connected to the most important and prestigious families of Jewish doctors in southern Italy, because his son, the only son he had with himself, because another son was left behind in Perpignan and remained Christian. So his family was split. His wife and second son were left behind in Perpignan, and we find them as Christians in the local archives until they are dead. Whereas he and his son went to Italy, and they ended up in southern Italy, and there his son got married to one of the daughters of one of the most prestigious families of Jewish doctors there. So meaning that he had been accepted back into the local Sephardi community, and probably he didn't need to hide any longer, because probably the conditions were favorable to his stay there. And this is where he translated this time from Latin into Hebrew, this medical work of this Andalusian Arabic author for his son. Because, as I have told you at the beginning, he was helping his son take these exams in order for him to become a real doctor. And so in order to help him take exams, he was handing him down the medical treatises he was familiar with, and in order to do so, he was translating them into Hebrew in order to demonstrate that that tradition was part of the Jewish tradition. It was not part of the non-Jewish tradition. This is very interesting also from a mental point of view, okay? We are trying to negotiate, in a certain sense, their new way of understanding their Jewish being in a non-Jewish environment while in southern Italy. So, well, this is a part of the gracious, this is, and again, we could keep talking and talking, but I want to stop here, and I hope there will be plenty of questions. There were many other families of physicians coming from Spain, from Provence, from Catalonia, who happened to be working in southern Italy, and most of them were familiar with this medical tradition, and most of them were familiar with the humanist tradition of science, which included what I told you. And for instance, this is a further case of a very important family of physicians who had come from Provence into southern Italy, into Naples first, and then into Apulia at the beginning, in the mid-14th century. And this manuscript was copied by this Calonimus, Benedict Calonimus. And if you will be here next week, if you will tolerate me once more or twice more, I don't know, you're probably too much bored now. I don't know. But you will hear about him next week. This will be the link with the Venetian experience, because Calonimus, Ben David Calonimus, we will find that Calonimus, Ben David Calonimus in Venice. He will be one of the most important chief characters, really, of the print adventures in Venice, because he will be responsible for the print of many Hebrew books in Venice in the 16th century. But before going to Venice, when he was still in Puglia and Bari, he copied an astronomical miscellany, a miscellaneous, a collection of astronomical treatises, which had been translated not from Hebrew, not from Latin, but from German by himself, because German astronomers were the most fashionable in the period. And so, in order to have those texts available within the Jewish world, they were translating those texts, which were popular in the period. And this time, he was translating those texts not only for his religionists, but also to dedicate a part of this treatise to a local prince who had hired Calonimus, Benedict Calonimus, as his personal astrologer. Okay, because this prince wanted to know what would happen with him, if we should have waged war against some other people, so he wanted to have his forecasts and his, and we have in this treatise all sorts of information about these forecasts made by Calonimus, Ben David Calonimus, for this very important prince, whom you might know. I'm just giving you his name. It was Ludovico il Moro, a very important figure of the Italian Renaissance, because he was one of the sponsors of Leonardo da Vinci while in Milan. But at the same time, Ludovico il Moro was in very good terms with the kings of Naples and had received the title of Duke of Bari, and this is the reason why Calonimus addressed him while in Bari, probably also to obtain some favors and some money. But so, what I'm showing you is that all these people came from Spain, from Provence, integrated into southern Italy, and created a new culture, which is absolutely a Renaissance culture, because it merged different aspects of science of that period and different languages. And all of those aspects were merged into these Hebrew translations, and then they were translated, all these things were translated by the same people into Latin to be accessible also to non-Jews. Okay.
Thank you so much, Fabrizio, for just a wonderfully textured and dramatic and really quite wide-ranging framework. And we're excited to actually have you for 2 more lectures next week. I'm sure all of us have many questions, and you've opened up so many avenues of possibility already. We're going to have about maybe 20 or so minutes of questions. We'll go to around 1:30. And then keep in mind, we do have 2 more lectures next week, and also kind of continuity. So I'll let you perhaps do the questions, and we may collect a couple at a time.
Yeah.
So why don't we just kind of go around, start it out, go this way, and then
Okay.
go back.
No.
I just have a question. I just wanted to thank the Viterbi family, Fabrizio Lelli, Sephardi scholar, and obviously a fountain of knowledge. The Viterbis wish they could be here, but their granddaughter is graduating from Yale this weekend, and they're all back east, so they send their regards, and we thank them.
Absolutely. And I was also the chair of the Center for Today's Advisory Board. Absolutely delighted to be able to have you participate in the culture. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So many questions I could ask. I was puzzled by what you said about Abraham de Galmes. Why would the Cardinal want a Hebrew translation of a Greek text, which may or may not have been translated into Latin? Was it perhaps that he was curious whether the Greek version differed from the text that he had, which shows great intellectual curiosity?
Yeah. So we keep going, and then I will answer.
We did a couple.
Okay.
And then after
And
that,
you will
final
remind me if I
question.
forget.
Sir, I would like to compliment you. It's a fantastic lecture that I absorbed totally.
Thank you.
And I like the fact that
I'm
you are,
delighted to hear that.
I like the fact that you're so eloquent and speaking it rather than reading it. And
That's what I'm trying to do, because I know that it's more boring if you read when you talk. I'm sorry if I made mistakes, man.
I have a lot of comments and I won't utter them all, just what's most important. I thought immoral indicates the Moorish nationality, if you wanted. And then I was in Lecce last year, pursuing the same interest. I'm a great believer in conservation. And so there is a community now in Lecce that meets at the synagogue. So our synagogue was closed, but there was an announcement that on such and such day they get together. This is a group of people that have rediscovered their Jewish roots, and I found that very, very precious, very important. And the last comment I make is that in Haifa, the greatest shipping magnate is Shoham. It must be one of those members of the family. And thank you again.
Thank you.
Chaim and Augusta.
One question is information. Joseph Bonfield, the father, is this the author of Tochnat Hanea? No. Okay. And
He was a physician himself. We just know that he was a physician.
I'm interested in terms of translations and traditions. What would they earn for their translations? Who would pay them? Some translations you indicated were personal, but obviously they were professionals. Were some of the translators working in a collective for a particular patron? Was there a center of translation where there would be Jews and other people of other nationalities working together in terms of producing a sort of a wisdom, a center of wisdom in any of these locales.
Thank you.
Maybe one more.
Yeah, one more, because otherwise it's long to answer. Yeah.
Very quickly, I don't remember whether Avicenna, the famous doctor, was Jewish or Muslim?
Muslim. Yeah. So, okay. So, why Grimani? Yeah. So let's start with his name. The name of the patron who sponsored Abraham de Balmes while in Venice was Grimani, Cardinal Grimani. Grimani was very important, belonged to one of the most important family of the Venetian aristocracy, and he had been very closely related to Giovanni Pico della Mirandola and to other humanists who were deeply interested in tracing back the original texts of the most important philosophical authorities from the Greek world. As a matter of fact, at the same time, when the Byzantine scholars were reintroducing into Italy the Greek original texts of Aristotle, for instance, and humanists were working with the Greek Byzantines, the Greek-speaking Byzantines, to retrieve the original Aristotelian doctrines on the basis of the original texts. At the same time, the humanists realized, this is what I was telling you before, that they might know more about Aristotle using Arabic translations. So they were not using Arabic translations of Aristotelian texts, but Arabic translations of interpreters, of Aristotelian interpreters, who had interpreted Aristotle in a non-Greek way, so in an Muslim way, essentially. So they were interested in this non-Greek understanding of Aristotle, which might explain some characteristics of the Aristotelian thought which had been lost throughout the Middle Ages. I don't know if this is clear, but it was a way to trace back the original Aristotelian thought without the mediation of the Christians. It's an interesting approach. It's very modern, because they were familiar with these medieval authorities who had understood Aristotle in the Christian way. And they knew that those Christian authorities had understood this Christian Aristotle on the basis of Greek late texts. So by skipping all that and addressing Arabic authorities, they could trace back the Muslim reading of Aristotle, which possibly was closer to the Greek original text. It's an interesting idea. So what they were doing in Venice, especially, since the second half of the 15th century, they were doing that, especially in Venice. They were hiring Jewish scholars who were familiar with these Hebrew versions from Arabic. They were hiring the scholars to translate texts from Hebrew into Latin. And since this Cardinal Grimani was the sponsor of a major project of publication of the whole work of Aristotle in Greek, in Arabic, in other languages, and all of that should have been translated into Latin, he was paying these authors, these intellectuals, to provide new translations into Latin. And Abraham de Balmes was one of those. And again, excuse me for being so, I don't know, trivial probably, but this is again something that happens even nowadays. Sometimes you don't really rely on quality, but you rely on acquaintance. What I want to say is that, and this is again why I'm stressing so much the idea of the medical skills, because this cardinal, for instance, like many other aristocrats, were trusting those physicians as physicians. And so they were thinking that since they were very good physicians, they were also very good translators, philosophers, because they were talking to them. Again, what I'd like to stress is that when we think of the Renaissance period, we are generally inclined to think that there was a major phenomenon of osmosis between the different religious communities. I mean, people were meeting with people, and everybody was meeting with everybody else. It's not like that. I mean, there were only some people who were meeting some other people. And generally this happened at the very top levels of the society, top social levels. So what happened was that very important families of doctors were in touch with very important families of Christians, and those very important families of Christians trusted the skills of those doctors, and so they were thinking, and sometimes they were right, of course, that they were very good translators, faithful interpreters. And if you look at Abraham de Balmes' translations from Hebrew into Latin, they are very precise, meaning that he could understand perfectly the nature of the text, but the Latin translations are bad, are really bad. But this is what Cardinal Grimani had available. I mean, he knew the guy, and this was probably the only possibility he had to find a person who was familiar with those texts. And this is why Abraham de Balmes' translations became so popular throughout the 16th century, because they were printed in Venice, thanks to Cardinal Grimani. And so, for instance, this is very interesting because while working on this project, we found out that Galilee, you know Galilee, he, while studying Aristotle, because of course everybody had to study Aristotle, while studying Aristotle, he studied Aristotle on the basis of his Venetian publications, and he studied Aristotelian commentaries in the Abraham de Balmes translation. So imagine how important Abraham de Balmes was, but nobody understands that, because of course he was just a translator. But again, I'm not only referring to him as a translator, I'm trying to create, to reconstruct the environment. We know a lot of things about Abraham de Balmes, about his family, and we know a lot about his manuscripts, the manuscripts he owned. We know a lot of things about him. We know a lot about his methods, how he translated texts from Hebrew to Latin. It's very interesting. It's really very interesting. So just to come, not because I want to skip other questions, but just to come to the nature of these translations and how they were hired. This is a possible answer. They were hired because they knew them. Generally, they knew them because they were serving, the Jewish people were serving Christians as physicians. So this was the best way, the best communication, the best way to get in touch with the others. It was not always like that, but most always was like that. And how much they were paid? They were very decently paid, if I may say so, because some people made their living in that. And that's the reason why they were looking forward so much to meeting patrons, rich patrons. Because of course, the wealthier the patrons were, the more they were paid. The translators were paid, and they knew. So for instance, working for Pico was very good because Pico was known to be a very good payer. He was paying a lot, his translators. But other people were not paying that much, even if they were very wealthy. Or they, again, like today, they were having their translators wait a very long time. And so we find lots of notes in the manuscripts where the translators say, I've been waiting so long to be paid, and I don't have, and I'm starving, and I don't know how to do, and I'm keeping asking them to be paid, but they're not paying me, and of course they couldn't do anything. Okay? So it's interesting. They were very well paid, generally, sometimes more, sometimes less, but still, it was a very good job, a very good job. Sorry? Pico. Oh, yes. Giovanni Pico della Mirandola was probably one of the most, well, we have here one of the most important specialists, Pico Brian Coordinator. He's the best person who can talk about Pico in this room, but still. Giovanni Pico della Mirandola was a very talented young person who died as a young, relatively young man. And during his very brief life, he was very wealthy. He belonged to one of the wealthiest family, Italian aristocrat families from northern Italy. And he put a lot of money in, sorry?
From which part of Italy?
He was from a very tiny place called Mirandola, which is very close to, let's say that it's near Bologna. If you know where Bologna is, more or less, it's near Bologna. And he was, since he was so wealthy, he had the possibility to attend different universities, the most important universities of his time, and among those universities he went to Padua. And Padua, in those days, was the most important Aristotelian center for Aristotelian studies. And that's the reason why he met there some Jewish guys who were working in the Paduan environment, and he sort of befriended them, and he asked them to help him translate some texts from Hebrew to Latin, and he started up a new process which would become popular in the 16th century of connections between Christians and Jews on translations. Okay? He was one of the first humanists who actually understood the importance of having Jewish partners translating works. So, what they were doing, to go back to your question, what they were doing was they were working together. They were generally working together. I mean, there was the Jewish guy who was working with the Christian one, and they were sitting at the same table and working on the same texts, and of course the Jewish guy was generally suggesting a possible translation, sometimes in good Latin, sometimes in bad Latin, depends. And then the Christian guy, generally who was more fluent in Latin, was generally rephrasing the Latin text. Sometimes. Sometimes the Jewish translators were acting separately and they were just translating and then sending the translations to their patrons. As a matter of fact, this had been the usual way to work in Spain in the previous centuries. Generally, Jewish translators were working along with non-Jews, and sometimes they were working in parties of 3 people. One was translating from Hebrew into the local language, meaning, for instance, Castilian or Catalan. And then there was a non-Jewish guy who was translating from Catalan into Latin, and then there was a third person who was making this Latin more fluent. It was a major task, and for that they needed a lot of money. And there were very important kings of Spain who were deeply devoted, committed to this translation process. And this happened also in southern Italy, particularly in Naples during the 14th century and still in the 15th century. But the situation varied according to the period, according to the social conditions, according to the Jewish presence in the States. So, again, you pointed out something. First and foremost, it's not Lecce where they opened the new synagogue, it's Trani, not far from Lecce. So in Lecce, there's not a community. I think you were in Trani because this was it was an incredible phenomenon. It was an incredible phenomenon because all of a sudden, so to say, there was this revival of Jewish traditions, and there were Christians, Catholics, who, in my opinion, in a very strange way, but I don't want to interfere with their ideas, but they kind of started to say that their ancestor had been a Muslim, meaning they had been forced to conversion for many reasons, which is really impossible to find out today, but they hold so, they believe so. And so they decided to ask for a conversion, and they were converted by the community of Rome. And now there is a community in Trani, which depends on the community of Naples. It's a branch. It's actually a branch of the community of Naples, so the rabbi comes from Naples. And then now they are about to open a new branch of the community of Trani in Brindisi, which is very close to Lecce.
There is an old synagogue
Yes.
in Lecce.
The synagogue in Lecce has been totally destroyed. And the only thing that remains of the synagogue in Lecce is a stone.
Yes.
It's an inscribed, carved stone,
Right.
which has been reemployed in the basement of a Renaissance building. And by chance, they found this stone and they could trace back to
They
the
are
synagogue.
promoting it as a tourist spot now.
Yes, they're promoting it as everywhere. If you go to Barcelona, for instance, nothing remains because everything has been destroyed. And the city is totally, most of the city, particularly Lecce, the present day Lecce belongs to the 16th and 17th century, so to periods when the community had been long gone. But still, for instance, there still is a street which is called Synagogue Street in Lecce, which means that probably those who called the street, that gave the street the name, were familiar with the idea that in the area there was one synagogue. And actually, they found out the stone in the building in the street. So it's possible that the synagogue was there. I have a theory that it's possible to find where the synagogue was because there's a chapel, a Renaissance chapel, which probably took the place of the original synagogue. This is possible, but it's not certain. But in Trani, you still have two of the four major synagogues. They still are there. They're still extant. And one of the synagogues has been given back to the present community and is still used for the rite. And it's a beautiful example of the Gothic synagogue. It's one of the oldest synagogues probably in Europe. It's beautiful. And the second synagogue has been recently turned into the Museum of Apulian Jews, which is very interesting as well. It's beautiful because it's a synagogue, then turned into church, then turned back, restored to look like a synagogue or less, and shaped into a museum, very interesting museum of Apulian Jews. It's very interesting. If you go to Trani, you definitely must visit the two synagogues.
So listen, we are out of time right now. We can do a little bit of informal Q&A. And remember, we have 2 more sessions on Tuesday and Wednesday of next week.
Yeah.
Same time, same place.
Write down your
Please
questions.
thank Professor Lelli for his